Cora Mercer did not look down at her hands when the laughter went around the association floor, though every cattleman leaning on the sail ring rails knew she had walked 11 miles of frozen ruts to stand there and be laughed at. She had come to the fall meeting of the Sweetgrass Stockmen's Association to say a plain thing out loud in front of witnesses: that she meant to honor her dead husband's contract and put 600 beef steers on the cars at Bannock Forks by the 15th of October, 40 days off and 280 miles of hard trail away, and she had gotten as far as the number 600 before the room decided it was the funniest thing it had heard since the drought broke. She stood in the sawdust with the $2,200 note on the bar M folded in her coat pocket like a second heartbeat, and she let them laugh, and she counted, the way her husband had taught her to count anything that frightened her, slow, from 1, until her pulse came back down under her own hand. If this is your kind of country, take one quiet second to subscribe and ride along, because what a widow and a moon-eyed mare did over the 40 days that followed, across a dry river, a cut fence, a stampede started in the dark, and the first blizzard of that hard winter, is the kind of drive the Sweetgrass told on itself for the next 50 years, and told wrong every time. The meeting was held in the sale barn at Arden, because Arden had the only roof in the county big enough to put every brand under at once, and the smell of it was cold manure and pipe smoke and wet wool. 40 men and a scatter of their wives filled the plank seats above the empty ring, and Cora had come down the center aisle in her good gray dress with her chin level, which the county had long ago decided was pride, and which was in fact only the discipline of a woman who had learned that if she let her face move at all, it would move all the way. She was 31 years old that autumn. She was not a large woman. Her hands were a working hand's hands, and there was a white line on the third finger of the left one, where a wedding band had worn the skin for 9 years, and then been sold, in the second bad winter, to a jeweler in Bannock Forks, who gave her $8 for it and looked sorry about it, which was more than most. Now, Ms. Mercer. That was Vint Cardwell, who ran the meeting because his father had run it, a soft, heavy man who was not unkind and not much else either. Nobody here doubts your grit, Lord knows. But a fall gather and a long drive is a hard thing for a full crew of grown men to bring off in a good year, and this has not been a good year. There's no shame in selling your steers off the range at the going figure and clearing what you can against your paper. The going figure is $9 a head, and everyone in this barn knows it, Cora said. Her voice was low, and it carried, because she had pitched it to carry off of green colts and drunk men, and did not have to raise it now. My contract is for 22. 600 head at $22 is $13,200. $9 off the range is $5,400, and my note is $2,200, and my winter is 5 months long. I can do the arithmetic on the difference, Mr. Cardwell, so can every man who is laughing. That quieted a corner of the room, because it was true, and because a Stocktown will forgive a woman anything faster than it will forgive her doing sums out loud. But it was into that particular little silence that Colonel Ezra Bragg chose to unfold himself up off the front rail, and the room turned to him the way iron filings turn. Because Ezra Bragg was the Sweetgrass country the way weather is a country, the largest thing in it, and the thing every smaller thing arranged itself around. He was 55 that year, and he had given himself the rank of colonel somewhere back down the trail of his own story, in a war his own age made it unlikely he had fought in, and no man in the county had ever been fool enough to ask him about it twice. He owned the Anvil. Anvil cattle grazed from the Sweetgrass breaks to the edge of the reservation and drank at 40 miles of water that had been free grass and open creek before Bragg's crews strung the wire, and Anvil paper lay under half the smaller brands in the room the way silt lies under still water. He wore a good black coat and a gray hat the color of a dove's breast, and he came down the plank steps into the ring with his hat in his hand, which was the most dangerous thing he did all day, because Ezra Bragg with his hat off was Ezra Bragg being kind, and his kindness had cost more men their outfits than his anger ever had. "I'm going to say something out of turn," he told the room, "and Cora Mercer can slap my face for it if she's a mind." He turned to her, and his face was broad and weathered and genuinely warm, and that was the worst of him. "Girl, I stood up at Elias's grave 2 winters ago, and I meant every word. Your husband was the best trail boss ever threw a bed on a wagon in this territory. And if he'd lived, you'd not be standing in this sawdust, and neither would I be saying this. But he did not live. And it is a cruelty, not a kindness, to let you kill yourself and lose the place both, when there is an easy way through that lets you keep your pride and your winter grass." "Say the easy way, Colonel," Cora said, "so the witnesses hear it." Something flickered behind the warmth, quick, like a fish under ice, and was gone. "I'll take the contract off your hands," he said, spreading his own hands wide to the room. "I'll deliver your 600 with my Bannock herd. My crews are trailing that way regardless, and I'll pay your note in full at the bank tomorrow morning, so it's off your neck before the snow flies. In exchange, you deed me the Sweetgrass Creek water and the east half of the Bar M bench, which is no earthly use to a widow woman running 40 saddle horses and no cattle, and you keep your house, your garden, your horses, and your good name. You winter easy. I've had my lawyer draw it fair." He looked around the barn, collecting the nods he had grown there like a crop. "That is a Christian offer, and there is not a man here would call it otherwise." There was not. The barn hummed its agreement, and a few of the wives looked at Cora with the particular pity that is 3 parts relief it is not them. It was, laid out flat in the sawdust, the whole of Ezra Bragg's genius he had offered in front of 40 witnesses to save her. And the price of being saved was her water, which was the only thing on the Bar M he had ever wanted, and without which the rest of the place was a dry 40 and a view. He would pay $2,200 to a bank and take back range worth 10 times that. And the county would remember for a generation that he had done it out of the goodness of his heart. Cora looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at the note in her hand, and then she did the thing that decided the next 40 days, which was that she folded the note back into her pocket and shook her head once, slow side to side, the way you tell a horse no when yes would hurt it worse. "I thank you for standing up at Elias's grave," she said. "I'll not sell his water off the back of it. I'll trail my own steers to my own contract, and I'll be at Bannock Forks by the 15th with the tally in my hand, and then I'll come home and pay my own note over my own counter." She turned to the room, and for the first time she let a little of it into her voice. Not much, a hairline. "I came here to ask no favor, and I'm leaving with none. But I'll ask you to remember, when it's told, that I stood in this barn and said I'd do it, and that Colonel Bragg stood here and offered to see that I couldn't." It was too fine a line for most of the room to feel the edge of, and Bragg only smiled and put his hat back on, which meant the kindness was over. But Vint Cardwell felt it, and looked down at his own boots. And old Harmon Sledge, the district judge, who was there for the whiskey and not the cattle, took his cigar out of his mouth and studied the small gray woman in the ring with a new and unlaughing attention, and filed her away, the way a judge files a thing he suspects he will see again under oath. She walked out through the pens where the association kept its sale stock, and she did not let her hands shake until she was through the far gate and up on the seat of the wagon, and by then it was only the cold. Elias used to say a herd reads your seat before it reads your rope, And a town is only a herd that talks. And in the 2 years since the pneumonia took him, 3 weeks flat on his back after he brought the last bunch in through an October norther, coughing pink into a rag while she boiled onions and prayed, and neither one did any good, Cora Mercer had given the town nothing off her seat at all. Not at the burying. Not at the 2 hard winters. Not when the bank turned the note over in her hands like a thing already spoiled. She had held 40 acres of deeded ground and a section of leased grass and a string of good horses together with her own 2 hands and a hired boy when she could pay one. And she had heard herself called the Widow Mercer in the voice men use for a gate that hangs crooked. And she had learned exactly one lesson from all of it, which was Elias's lesson. And it was this: the trail does not ask what a thing is worth in the daylight. It asks what it has left after dark. She said it to herself now, out loud, on the cold seat, the way she said it most days, and then she gathered the lines and clucked to the team and drove the 11 miles home under a sky the color of a gun barrel, and the last 2 miles the road ran along her own wire. And beyond the wire on the good grass of the Sweetgrass bench her steers stood dark and heavy, and gathered against the coming weather, 600 and a few over, every one of them wearing the bar M she and Elias had burned into the first ones together the spring they were married. A plain bar and a plain M, the humblest brand in the county, and the only thing besides the horses and the note that was still entirely hers. The mare was waiting at the home corral when she drove in, as the mare was always waiting, standing a little apart from the geldings the way she stood apart from everything, watching the wagon come with the one eye that could and the one eye that could not. Blue was a blue roan, 9 years old that fall, dark as trail dust and dappled through the barrel like smoke over slate, black-legged, black-maned, with a scatter of roan ticking through her face that made her look, in some lights, like a horse seen through falling snow. She stood a shade over 15 hands, and she was built downhill and deep through the girth. A using horse, a cow horse, nothing showy about her from the near side at all. It was the offside that had made her a legend of the wrong kind. Her right eye was blue. Not the soft brown of an honest horse, but a pale moon-colored glass blue eye, blind or near it, an eye that caught lantern light and threw it back like a coin at the bottom of a well. And the Sweetgrass country, which knew a great deal about cattle and almost nothing about mercy, had looked into that eye exactly once, 2 years back, and decided everything it intended to decide about her. Moon-eyed, they called her, moon-blind. A wall-eyed Jonah horse that would spook at her own shadow on the blind side and take a whole herd over a cutbank doing it. They had told Elias to shoot her when she was a filly, and the eye first went pale. And Elias had laughed and gentled her instead, and hung a little brass bell at her throat latch, and made her the bell mare of his cavy, the steady one, the one the whole loose string of saddle horses would follow anywhere in the dark for the sound of that bell, and when he lay dying he had spent some of his last plain breath on her. "Keep the bell mare," he'd said. "Whatever you have to sell, Cora, don't sell Blue. She sees fine. She just sees by a different light than they do." They had offered her $1 for the mare, twice, the 2 men who came looking for cheap horseflesh in the bad winters, $1 cash for the moon-eyed Jonah, take her off your feed bill, and both times Cora had said no, and meant it more than she meant most things. She hung the bell on a nail by the kitchen door where it stayed silent for 2 years, and she kept the mare, and she could not have told the bank or the association or her own tired self exactly why, except that when she stood at the corral in the worst of the dark, broke and alone and 11 miles from a friend, the mare would come across the pen to her, without being called, and put that pail. Useless eye against her shoulder and breathe, and it was the only thing in the Sweetgrass country that had never once, not one time, laughed. A drive of 600 head wants 10 hands and a cook and a horse wrangler, or 8 if the hands are good and the cattle gentle, and Cora had spent the summer quietly making her arrangements the way Elias had taught her, a word here, a handshake there, so that when she rode into Arden the Monday after the association meeting to hire her crew, she believed she had 8 men promised and a cook half promised, and she found out inside of an hour that she had none. She found it out the way you find out most things in a stock town, in pieces, off men who would not meet her eye. Del Rooney, who had ridden 2 summers for Elias and shaken her hand on it in July, had taken on with the Anvil for the winter feed crew at $40 a month, which was $10 over the going wage and about $30 more than the work was worth. The Pettibone brothers, who she had counted on for the point, had been told by somebody they respected that a fall drive bossed by a widow was a good way to get a man killed and his name laughed at, and had reconsidered. One by one, all week, in the feed store, and at the livery, and on the church step, her crew came apart in her hands, and not one man of them had been threatened, not out loud, because Ezra Bragg did not threaten. He hired. He suggested. He let it be understood. And by the following Saturday the word had gone all up and down the Sweetgrass that riding for the widow Mercer was a thing a sensible man did not do, and the widow Mercer had, by her own count, 1 hand. The one was Toby Hale, and he was 19, a young man, but only barely, all wrists and Adam's apple, an orphan off a failed homestead who had wintered in her barn 2 years running and would have walked into a river for her if she'd pointed at it. He sat at her kitchen table that Saturday night, turning his hat in his hands, and told her, miserable, that Mr. Rooney had said there'd be no work anywhere in the county come spring for any man who'd rode for her and lost, and that the Anvil paid its winter hands whether they worked or not, and that he was ashamed of himself, and that he'd stay if she told him to, but he was so afraid of the whole thing he could hardly eat. Cora looked at him a while, the lamp between them, and then she did the hardest generous thing she did that fall, which was to let him off. "Go on to the Anvil, Toby," she said. "Take the winter wage. You're too young to hang your whole name on my drive before you've got a name to hang." He started to argue, and she stopped him with a hand flat on the table. "I mean it. There's no debt. You keep the roan colt you've been starting. He's yours. I'll ride it out. And if it comes a day you're free of them, and you've a mind to ride, you know my wagon." He went out into the dark, crying a little and trying not to, and she sat at the table until the lamp guttered, and she did not cry, because that was a rule she had. But she came nearer to it that night than she had at the burying. So it was that with the better part of 2 weeks already bled off her 40 days by the hunt for a crew, Cora Mercer had 600 steers to gather and road brand and trail 280 miles, and no crew at all, and she did the only thing left to do, which was to go hire the men the county had thrown away, because they were the only men in the Sweetgrass whose wages Ezra Bragg had. Not troubled to buy, for the plain reason that Ezra Bragg, like the county, had already decided they were worth nothing. She went first to a man named Cole Yarrow, and she went to him last in her own mind, which is to say, she had thought of him first the night her crew fell apart, and had spent a week finding reasons not to, because hiring Cole Yarrow was, in the county's arithmetic, the same as hiring the Mare, an admission that she had come down to the bottom of the barrel and was scraping the stave. Cole Yarrow was a lean, still, deliberate man of about 40, who had once been the best trail boss between the Sweetgrass and the Platte, and had not bossed a herd in 4 years. 4 years back he had been trailing 3,000 head for a big outfit, an Anvil-connected outfit, though the county's memory had gone conveniently soft on that part, when the herd stampeded in a dry lightning storm below a place called Coyle's Reef, and went over a cutbank in the dark, and 2 men died, and 1,100 head were lost or crippled. And the outfit needed a reason that was not weather, and not its own cheap fences, and it found one in the boss. It was said Cole Yarrow had bedded the herd wrong, and had been drinking, and had lost his nerve when the lightning started, and gotten 2 good men killed doing it. None of it was true. He had bedded the herd on the only flat water for 20 miles, because the outfit's own map lied about the reef, and he had not had a drink in his life, and he had gone over the cutbank himself in the black dark to pull one of the dying men out, and carried him 1.5 miles before the man died in his arms anyway. But the outfit told it the other way, loud, in every bare room on the trail. Because a dead trail boss's reputation is cheaper than a lawsuit, and Cole Yarrow, being the kind of man he was, had never once in 4 years stood up in a bear room and told it back. He had simply stopped bossing herds. He ran a few horses on a hard-scrabble quarter section up Dutchman's Draw, and he came to town twice a year, and men who had liked him crossed the street now. Not out of hate, but out of the queasy human wish not to be reminded that a good name is a thing the crowd holds and can drop. Cora found him mending a corral in the cold with his coat off, and he straightened up when she rode into the yard and stood holding a length of wire and looked at her without surprise, as though he had been expecting her for a week, which perhaps he had. Mr. Yarrow, she stayed up on Blue, because a thing like this is easier said from a horse. I've 600 steers to put on the cars at Bannock Forks by the 15th, a contract worth 22 a head, and a note that eats my range if I miss. Bragg's bought off every hand in the county. I've got a wagon, a good remuda, a fair cook if I can get the one I want, and no crew. I'm told you were the best that ever bossed a herd in this country before they hung Coil's Reef around your neck, and I'm told most of what they hung there was a lie. I can pay $1 a day and a share of what clears over the note, which may be nothing, and I can offer you the one thing the Anvil can't, which is a chance to boss a herd through to the cars in front of every man that ever crossed the street on you. I'd be obliged if you'd be my segundo. He was quiet a long moment, turning the wire in his hands the way the mare turned to look at a new thing with her good eye, taking his time, and she made herself sit still under it. Behind her the mare shifted, and the little brass bell. She had taken it down off the nail that morning and hung it back at Blue's throat latch, and it had rung the whole 11 miles like something waking up. The little bell chimed once in the cold, and Cole Yarrow's eyes went to it, and something in his still face moved. That Elias Mercer's bell mare, he said. It was not a question, the one they all said to shoot. The same. He was right not to. Cole Yarrow set the wire down on the top rail, careful, and reached for his coat, and that was the whole of his saying yes. He never did say it in words. Then or later. I'll want to pick 2-3 men myself, he said, shrugging into the coat. Men that are like the mare and me. You'll not have heard a good word about a one of them. Then they'll fit right in, Cora said, and something happened at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, and was the first thing close to one in a long time, and Cole Yarrow saw it, and looked away from it the way a decent man looks away from a thing that is not his yet, and went to catch his horse. The crew Cole Yarrow picked was, man for man, exactly what he had promised, a crew of the thrown away, and the best $600 worth of horseflesh and manhood in the territory, if you knew how to look, which the county did not. He got Ike Sunday for the top hand, a broad, soft-spoken black cowboy of about 45 who had come up the trail from Texas a dozen times and forgotten more about handling cattle than the Pettibone brothers would ever learn, and who could not get top hand wages anywhere in the Sweetgrass for the one reason that had nothing to do with his hands, and who took Cora's $1 a day and her offered share and her level handshake and said only, "Elias hired me 2 summers, paid me the same as the white boys, and never made a speech about it." I'll finish what he started. He got Refugio Salas, a lean gray vaquero the whole county called Cuco, who could rope anything that moved and read weather off the backs of birds, and had been let go by 3 outfits for the crime of being better than the foreman's son. He got old Nate Cobb to cook, a stove-up, bandy-legged little man of past 60, with a hip that had healed crooked after a horse fell with him, who could no longer ride a full day but could drive a chuck wagon through the eye of a needle and feed 12 men out of a Dutch oven in a gale, and who had been living on the county's charity in a lean-to behind the livery, and wept, once, hard, turned away so no one would see, when Cora asked him would he please boss her wagon. 4 men, an old cook, and a widow, and a moon-eyed mare with a bell. They gathered the herd in 3 cold, bright days at the end of September, and if the county could have seen the gather, it would have stopped laughing that week instead of later. Because a good crew working easy is a quiet thing, and this crew, thrown away as it was, worked like water finding its level. Cora rode blue for the gather, and she found out for certain in those 3 days what she had only half known in 2 years of chores, that the moon-eyed mare was the finest cow horse on the place. The blind side, that the county was so sure would spook her, did the opposite. Blue trusted her good eye, and her ears, and her feet, and the woman on her back, and did not shy at what she could not see. Because she had made her peace with the dark long ago, she would work a steer out of the brush on the blind side, by sound and by feel, ears swiveling, sure-footed as a cat, and she never once in 3 days put a foot wrong. And in the evenings, when they turned the day's gather loose on the bed ground, and the saddle horses were hobbled out to graze, the little bell rang soft in the dusk, and the loose horses drifted to it and settled. And the cattle settled to the horses, and old Nate Cobb, banging his pans, said to no one, in the flat voice of a man stating a fact he does not expect to be believed, that there is the steadiest bell mare I ever throwed a bean at. Moon-eyed, my crooked hip. That mare could night herd blindfold, and near enough does. The night before they took the trail, Cora rode blue up the rise above the creek to where Elias was buried, and she did a thing she had not let herself do in the 2 years since the burying, which was to say the whole of it out loud to him. The grave was a plain sandstone slab she had bought and lettered herself, and the grass had grown up around it, and the bell mare stood ground tied among the headstones as easy as she stood anywhere, the little brass bell chiming soft when she cropped the grass. Cora sat down in the dry grass with her back to the stone, the way she used to sit with her back to him at the end of a long day, and she told him about the association floor, and Bragg's kindness, and the crew that came apart in her hands, and the 4 thrown-away men and the old cook, and the note and the 40 days. And then she told him she was scared, which she had not said to a living soul, and that she was going to do it anyway, and that she had put his bell back on his mare, and meant to follow it to the cars or die trying, and she asked him, not expecting an answer, whether she was a fool. The answer, such as it was, came up the rise behind her in the dusk on a shod horse, and it was Cole Yarrow, who had ridden out to check the remuda one more time before dark, and seen her horse against the sky, and almost turned back, and had not, and now sat his horse a respectful way off, with his hat in his hand, and said, "Beg pardon. I'll leave you to it." "Stay if you want," Cora said, not turning. He'd not mind the company. He liked a man that checked the remuda twice. Cole got down and came and stood a little way off, looking at the stone and read the lettering, and was quiet a while. Then he said the thing that was, she understood later, his way of answering the question she had asked the dead man. He'd not call you a fool. A fool sells cheap and sleeps easy. You're the other kind. And that was all. And it was enough, and they rode back down the rise together in the near dark, with the bell ringing between them, and Cora Mercer felt for the first time since the pneumonia, not less alone, but alone in better company. They provisioned in Ardon the next morning before the branding, and the town turned out to watch, the way a town turns out for a hanging, or a wedding, or any other thing it has already decided the ending of. They stood in the store doors and along the boardwalk and watched Nate Cobb load the chuck wagon with flour and beans and dried apples and a keg of the cheap molasses, watched Ike Sunday and Cuco Salas throw the diamond hitch on the bedwagon, watched the moon-eyed mare stand hip shot at the rail with her bell, and the town's verdict traveled the boardwalk in the low tone people use for the truly doomed. Josiah Frame came out of the bank in his shirt sleeves and stood on the step and said, "Warm as ever, Cora. That note's the 15th of November, and I'd hate to see it come to foreclosure. I truly would. There's still time to take the Colonel's offer and winter easy." And Cora said, "There's time for you to hate a good many things before the 15th, Mr. Frame," and finished loading. Ellen Cardwell and two of the sewing circle stood under a shared parasol and watched the four thrown-away men and the widow and the cursed mare roll out of Ardon, and one of them said, distinctly, "Poor thing," in the tone that means the opposite, and Cora heard it and did not let it land anywhere it could be seen. And there was one man in a good coat, leaning in the mouth of the livery, who watched the whole outfit go, and then went inside and wrote a short message and rode fast for the Anvil, because Ezra Bragg liked to know the shape of a thing before it got to him. And Cora marked the man and said nothing, and added him to the account she was keeping, the one that was not in the tally book. They branded and counted at the home corral in the cold, dark hours before the 1st of October, and Cora lit the branding fire herself, kneeling to it with a match and a handful of dry cedar, the way Elias had lit 10,000 of them. And when it caught and threw its light up on the gathered steers and the waiting men and the pale, patient eye of the mare, old Nate Cobb, warming his crooked hands at it, said the thing that was as close to a blessing as that outfit was going to get well. "It ain't much of a crew, and it ain't much of a fire, and Lord knows it ain't much of a chance. But I've seen big outfits with fat crews and fine fires and every chance in the world lose a herd for want of one thing this outfit's got, and that's a boss that'll tell the truth in the tally book when it's costing her." He spat and picked up his branding iron. "Let's count 'em out honest and go." They road branded the day they took the trail. A day of dust and bawling and the sweet, sick smell of singed hair, and they counted as they branded, and the count was where Elias came back to her hardest. He had kept his tally in a little leather book the size of a testament, greasy and swelled with weather, and in the back of it, in his slow, square hand, were the counts of every drive he ever bossed. Each herd tallied out of the branding fire and into the trail and delivered on the far end, and under the last count he ever made, the October herd, the one he brought in through the norther that killed him, he had written nothing at all, because he had not lived to close it. Cora carried the book in her coat against her breast the whole drive. And every night on the bed ground she opened it by the fire and set down the day's tally in her own hand under his, and it steadied her the way the mare steadied the cattle. Because a tally is the one thing on a drive that does not care about your name or your sex or the county's opinion. 611 head went into the trail that first morning. Cole Yarrow tallied them out one gate, and Ike Sunday tallied them independently out the other, and the two counts agreed to the head, and Cole nodded at her across the dust and said, "That's a straight count, boss. Write it down." And the word boss, the first time he said it, landed on her the way the 15 minutes had never landed on any woman, and she wrote it down. The trail ran north and east out of the Sweetgrass, down off the bench through the breaks to the Powder Road, and then the long 200 miles of open country to the railhead. And for the first 4 days it went so well that Cole Yarrow got quiet in the particular way of a man who does not trust weather that fine. They made 12 and 14 miles a day. The steers were big and gentle and trail broke from the summer range, and they strung out in the mornings a mile long, and Ike Sunday sang to them at the point in a low rolling voice that carried back the length of the herd, and Cuco held the swing, and Cole and Cora traded the drag and the flank, and old Nate Cobb ran the wagon on ahead to the next water and had the fire going and the beans on, before the dust of the herd came over the last rise. At night they bedded the herd on good ground and stood their watches 2 at a time, and Blue's bell rang soft out where the remuda grazed. And the nighthawk cattle that would spook at a coyote in a strange country lay, chewing their cud in the dark, because somewhere off in that dark was the steady sound of a bell they had followed all summer. And a mare who was not afraid. Cora learned her crew in those 4 days, and they learned her, and the learning went the one direction that matters, which is that they stopped watching to see if she knew her business and started simply doing theirs. She knew cattle. That was the thing the county had never once asked about the widow Mercer, because the county had decided what she was the day they buried Elias, and had not troubled to look again. But she had gathered and doctored and trailed beside her husband for 9 years, and before that she had grown up the daughter of a Missouri stock doctor, and had pulled her first calf at 11, and floated her first horse's teeth at 12, and she read a herd the way Ike Sunday read one. Off the set of their heads and the swing of their bags and the color of their manure, and on the 3rd day when she said, quietly, at breakfast, that the big line back steer on the left point was going lame in the off fore, and wanted cutting back to the drag before he soured the whole point. Cole Yarrow rode up and looked, and found the stone bruise she'd called from 40 feet, and said nothing, and moved the steer, and after that when Cora said a thing about the cattle the crew moved before they looked. The test came on the 5th day, and it was water, which on a fall drive in a drought year is the only test there ever really is. The Powder Road ran them into a stretch the freighters called the Dry Fork, 40 miles of gumbo and greasewood, where the map showed 3 creeks, and the drought had left standing in all 3 of them nothing but cracked mud and the white rime of alkali, poison to a thirsty steer that would drink it and bloat and die in sight of it. Cole Yarrow reined up on the lip of the first dry creek at noon, with the herd stringing up behind, and the heat coming off the flats in sheets, and Cora watched him do the trail boss's oldest arithmetic behind his still face, 40 miles of no water, a herd 2 days from the last drink, and a choice of gambling on a creek that might be running somewhere off the road or pushing the whole thirsty mass straight across the Dry Fork through the night and losing weight and maybe cattle doing it. He was a good enough boss to make either gamble and live with it. But it was Cora who put Blue down the cutbank into the dry creek and stepped off and knelt in the cracked gray mud and laid her bare hand flat against it, and then dug 2 fingers down into a low place where the greasewood grew a shade too green, and brought them up dark and cool. "There's water 3 feet under the whole of this," she said, standing, wiping her hand on her apron. "Elias hit it here in the dry summer of '81. There's a gravel reef under the mud holds it up. We dig a string of holes along the green line and let them seep, and we water the herd 100 at a time out of them by dark, and we lay over here tomorrow and rest them, and we cross the Dry Fork the next night in the cool with full bellies." She looked up at Cole Yarrow, and there was no triumph in it, only the flat certainty she used on green colts. "It's your call. But that's the water." Cole Yarrow looked at the green line of the greasewood, and at the mare standing hip-shot and patient in the dry creek with her pale eye catching the sun, and at the small woman with the mud on her hand, and he took off his hat and wiped his forehead with his sleeve and put it back on, which she was learning was the whole of his considering, and he said, "Get the spades, Ike." And the thing was decided, and by full dark there were 9 seep holes strung along the dead creek, brimming cool and sweet, and 611 head watered 100 at a time under the stars, and Cole Yarrow came and squatted by her fire while she wrote the day into Elias's book and said, after a while, in the voice of a man laying a plain fact on a bench, "He taught you good." "We taught each other," Cora said, writing. "That's the part the county never could feature." Cole Yarrow was quiet, watching the fire. Then he said, "I knew your husband. Some, enough to cross the street to shake his hand instead of the other way." He turned his hat in his hands. He come to Cheyenne the winter after Coyle's Reef, when it was all over the trail what I'd done. Or hadn't. Every man in the bar had his back to me. Elias Mercer walked the length of that bar and set his whiskey down next to mine and said, loud enough, I hear you carried Dutch Riley 1.5 miles with your own leg broke. I hear that from a man that was there. And drank his whiskey next to me and walked out. Never said another word about it. Didn't have to. He set the hat on his knee. I never got to pay him back for that. So, he looked at her once, across the fire, and then away. So I aimed to get his steers to the cars. It was for Collero, an oration, and Cora understood exactly what it had cost him, and exactly what it was and was not, and she did not embarrass either of them by answering it. She wrote the last of the day's tally, and closed the book, and they sat a while in the good silence of two people who have stopped needing to fill it, and out in the dark the bell rang once and once again, and was still. They crossed the dry fork on the 7th night in the cool with full bellies, and lost not a head, and came down on the morning of the 8th day to the one bridge in 90 miles. The toll bridge over the Sweetgrass proper, at a wide place called Kettle Crossing, where the river ran too deep and swift with the mountain snowmelt to ford a herd safely, and every drive north had crossed on the plank toll bridge for 11 years. $1 a wagon and 2 cents a head, posted and legal. And they found the bridge chained, and a man sitting a good horse in front of the chain with a rifle across the bows of his saddle, and behind him on the far bank, not troubling to hide, a dozen Anvil riders lounging at their ease around a fire, and the man on the good horse was Roy Deakins, Ezra Bragg's range boss, and he was smiling the small dry smile of a man who has been paid in advance to enjoy his morning. Roy Deakins was a different animal from his colonel, and Cora marked the difference the way you mark a rattler after you have been dealing with a bull. Bragg was appetite dressed as kindness. Deakins was nothing dressed as nothing. A spare, sallow, pale-eyed man of about 40 who did not raise his voice and did not need to, who had come up out of the New Mexico brush country with no history anybody could name, and a reputation among the few who would speak of it for being the man the Anvil sent when a Nestor's haystacks needed to catch fire or a small brand's bull needed to disappear. He wore a wolf-hide coat gone greasy at the collar, and a pair of long-shanked spade bits hung off his saddle that he did not use for kindness, and from his right wrist, coiled and ready, hung a saddle rope with a running iron shoved through the coils, a straight rod of iron with a hooked end, a horse trader's tool, and a brand blotter's tool both. And he wore it in plain sight the way another man wears a watch chain, because he wanted it seen. Morning, Ms. Mercer. He touched his hat with 2 fingers. Bridge is closed. The bridge is a public toll bridge, Mr. Deakins. It's been open 11 years. Company that owns it took on a new partner last week. Deakins's smile did not reach the pale eyes. Colonel bought controlling interest. New schedule of tolls got posted Tuesday, all legal, filed at the county. Wagons $5, cattle's $1 a head. He let that sit, watching her face for the place it would break, patient as a man watching a snare. 600 head, that's $600 cash, before a hoof touches plank. Reckon a widow woman's good for it. It was $600 she did not have, and he knew it. And it was, as he said, all legal, filed at the county, a private company's private toll on its private bridge. And there was not a court in the territory that would open that chain for her before the 15th of October, which was the entire point. Bragg did not need the toll to be lawful past the drive. He needed it to be lawful for 30 days. She sat blue in the road and looked at the chained bridge and the dozen idle riders on the far bank and the running iron hanging off Deakins's wrist. And she felt the whole shape of it settle over her, cold and complete. The association floor had been the joke, and this was the trap, and there would be more of it, all the way to Bannock Forks. each thing legal, each thing deniable, each thing costing her a day or a dollar or a head she could not spare, until the calendar did Bragg's murder for him, and he never once had to be unkind in public. "You tell the colonel," Cora said, and she kept her voice flat and let it carry to the men on the far bank that I heard him at the association say he'd take my drive off my hands as a kindness. "And you tell him I've now seen the shape of the kindness, and you tell him the toll's too rich for me, so I'll not be crossing his bridge." She turned Blue's head. "Come daylight tomorrow you can tell him I crossed his river instead, and it cost him 2 cents a head less than nothing." Deakins' smile thinned. "River's belly deep and running cold, ma'am. Snowmelt, you'll drown that herd trying to swim it, and half your outfit with it. There's no ford this side of the bridge for 40 mile, and the one below's been gone since the flood of '80. "You let me worry about the ford, Mr. Deakins," Cora said. "You've never in your life known the water in this country the way my husband knew it." And she rode back to the herd and left him sitting there, and she did not let her hands shake on the reins until the willows hid her, and then only a little, and only the once. She knew a thing Deakins did not know, and it was in Elias's book. Not in the tally. In the front of the book, where over 9 years Elias had penciled the private geography of a trail boss, the water and the grass and the bad ground of 400 miles of country. The things a man learns and does not tell because they are his stock in trade. And on a soft page near the front, in the slow square hand, was a note about the Sweetgrass, Old Nez Ford. 2 miles below Kettle, gone in the flood of '80, but the gravel bar rebuilt itself by '82, crossable in low water at the south bend where the cottonwood snag lies. Blue found it. Follow the Mare. Follow the Mare. Elias had written it 4 years ago, and Cora had read it 100 times in 2 years of grief, the way you read a dead man's hand for the man and not the words. And only now, sitting the same mare on the same river, did she understand that her husband had left her not a keepsake, but a map, and that the last line of it was an instruction she was now going to have to trust with 600 steers and 5 men and her whole life. They dropped down the river 2 miles in the failing light and made a cold camp without a fire so the Anvil would not read their smoke. And before first light Cora rode Blue alone down to the south bend, where a great bleached cottonwood snag lay half in the current, and she gave the mare her head. "Find it, girl," she said low, the way Elias would have said it, and she felt the mare change under her, felt the blind side stop being a blindness and start being a kind of listening. Blue put her nose down to the black water and worked along the bank with her ears going like a blind man's cane, feeling the push of the current against her legs. Reading the river by the one sense the county had never credited her with, which was the sense of a creature that has learned to trust what it cannot see, and 30 yards below the snag she stopped, and snorted, and stepped down off the cutbank into the river, sure as if there were a stair under the water, and there was. A gravel bar 2 feet under the cold brown push of it, angling across to the far bank at the exact slant a herd could hold, rebuilt by the river itself in the 4 years since a dead man last rode it. Cora sat the mare in the middle of the Sweetgrass, with the snowmelt tugging at her stirrups and the far bank coming pale out of the dark, and she put her hand down on the wet slate blue neck, and she said her husband's name out loud once, which she had not done in 2 years, and the mare's ear came back to catch it. They crossed at sunup, and it was the hardest 2 hours of the drive so far, and the making of the crew as a crew. Cora took Blue into the river first, with a lead steer's rope dallied to the horn, and the bell ringing bright over the water, and Ike Sunday pushed the point in behind her, and the herd, that would have milled, and refused a strange ford under a strange horse, took the water behind the sound of the bell they had followed all summer, string after string of them swimming with just their heads and the tips of their horns above the brown current, following the mare's bell across the sunken bar to the far shore. And it went well. It went beautifully for an hour and a half. until a big brindle steer in the third bunch lost the bar and went off the downstream edge into deep water and turned back in a panic and took 40 head with him into a mill in the middle of the river. What happened next, Cora saw all of, because she was in the middle of it, and she told it the same way ever after and never made herself the hero of it, because the hero of it had 4 legs. The mill is the drowner of herds. A knot of swimming cattle turning on themselves in deep water will pull each other under and drown by the score, and a man on a horse in the middle of it is a man 1 bad second from the bottom of a cold river. Young Toby Hale would have gone into it, but Toby Hale was 30 miles back, drawing the Anvil's winter wage. And so it was Cora Mercer on the moon-eyed mare who turned into that mill of horns and thrashing water with her heart in her mouth. And it was Blue who did the thing no sound-eyed horse in the county would have done, which was to swim straight into a churning wall of panicked cattle on her blind side, trusting the woman's hands and her own feet over the terror of what she could not see, and shoulder the lead brindle steer, and turn him, and hold the turn, chest deep and swimming, until the mill unwound itself downstream of the bar, and the 40 head strung back onto the crossing, and swam for the bell. They lost 3 steers off the downstream edge, drowned, 3 head out of 611, and they lost Kuko's hat and one of Nate Cobb's water barrels. And they very nearly lost Cora, who came up the far bank soaked to the shoulders and gray in the face and shaking so hard she could not at first get down off the mare, and Cole Yarrow rode up beside her streaming water, and did not touch her, because he was that kind of man, but sat his horse close alongside hers, with his shoulder near enough to her shoulder that she could feel the warmth of it, through 2 wet coats, and said low, so the others would not hear, "Easy. Now, easy, you're over. You and the mare both." And Cora got her breath, and got down, and put her arms around the mare's wet neck in front of all of them, and did not care who saw. And Ike Sunday tallied the herd on the far bank, twice, and it came 608, and he said, 3 head to the river, boss. And Cora took out Elias's book with wet hands, and wrote it down. 608, and under it. Because a tally is the only truth on a drive, and she meant to keep it true. 3 head lost at Nez Ford, no fault of the crew. And she did not write down the other true thing, which was that a dead man had reached 4 years across a river to hand her the crossing, because some counts you keep only in the book of yourself. The river had cost them a day and 3 steers, and the days were the thing now. Cora did her sums every night by the fire, with the stub of a pencil, the same sum Deacons had wanted her to break on at the bridge, only she did it to steel herself and not to weep. So many miles made, so many left, so many days to the 15th, and the margin thinning like ice in a thaw. They had come 90 miles in 9 days. They had 190 to go, and 16 days to do it in, which was room enough in a fair year on a gentle trail, and no room at all if the Anvil could steal 3 or 4 days out of her, with legal chains and quiet cruelties between here and the cars. She understood now that this was the whole game, not to beat her in the open, which Bragg could not do without becoming in public the thing he was in private, but to nibble the calendar to death, a day here, a day there, deniable every time. Until the 15th came and went, and the widow was simply, sadly, a little late, and the range fell to the Anvil the way ripe fruit falls, nobody's fault, an act of God and arithmetic. So the Anvil rode with them. Not close, but from the second day past the river there were always, at the edge of the country, 2 or 3 riders sitting their horses on a far ridge in the middle distance, watching the herd string along, making no move, saying nothing. There when the outfit rose in the dark, and there when it bedded down, a patience that got into the crew worse than any threat would have. Kuko named them the buzzards. Ike Sunday stopped singing at the point in the daytime, because a man does not sing when he is being watched, and took to humming it low only at night on the bedground where the dark was honest. And Cole Yarrow rode wider, and slept lighter and said little, but Cora saw him at the noon halts riding out alone to the low places, and the springs ahead of the herd, and coming back with his face shut. And on the 11th day she rode out with him, and found out why. The spring at Antelope Sinks, the only sweet water in a dry 20 miles, the water every drive on the Powder Road had watered at for 20 years, had been fouled. Someone had dragged the bloating carcass of an Anvil cow into the little walled pool at the head of the spring and left it there to rot in the water 2 days ahead of a thirsty herd, and there was no proving who, because it was an Anvil cow dead of Anvil business on open range, and cattle die, and it was the sort of thing that happens, and it had cost the water for a week. Cole Yarrow stood looking down at it a long time, and then said, in the flattest voice Cora had yet heard him use, "I've bossed 100 drives. I never once seen a man foul water. There's things you don't do out here, because the country'll kill us all without our help. A man that'll poison a spring." He did not finish it. He turned his horse. "We'll dry camp and push for the Crazy Woman branch. It's brackish, but it won't kill them." And that night they made a dry camp and a cold one, and the buzzards sat their ridge against the last of the light. And in the small hours a grass fire started in the dry bunchgrass, a quarter-mile up the wind of the bedground, started clean and low and quiet, the way lightning does not start a fire. No storm in the sky. A fire that a herd would smell and rise to, and run from straight down the wind into the badland breaks, and it was Blue who saved them the second time, because Blue's bell was ringing on the near side of the remuda when the wind brought the smoke, and the cattle that would have bolted rose instead, and turned their faces to the bell, milling and blowing, but held by the sound of the mare. While the crew rode the fire's edge with wet slickers, and beat it out along a cutbank before it could jump, and stood black-faced and coughing in the dawn, looking at the burned quarter-mile and the hoof-cut ridge above it, where 3 horses had sat and watched their fire not work, and then ridden off north in the dark. That was the 11th night. And it was the night Cora Mercer stopped being afraid and got angry, which are 2 different weathers, and the second is more use on a trail. She sat by the rekindled breakfast fire with the soot on her face and Elias's book on her knee, and she said to the whole crew plainly the thing that had been assembling itself in her for a week. "They don't mean to delay us. I had that wrong. A man that only wanted to make me late wouldn't foul a spring and fire a bedground. Too much chance of a court asking why. Bragg means to have these cattle. He means for us to come apart somewhere out here, in the dark, in the dry, on ground where no witness lives for 40 miles, and lose the herd scattered to the 4 winds. And then he means to gather my strays off the open range all winter, wearing my brand, and blot every bar M of them into an anvil, with that iron Deacon's wears on his wrist. And come spring, there'll be no 600 head anywhere but in his tally, and no widow anywhere but off her range, and the county will say the poor thing bit off more than she could chew, and God rest Elias." She looked around at them, at Ike and Kuko, and old Nate and Cole. "That's the play. I'd not blame a one of you for drawing your wage right here and riding clear of it. It's turned into more than a drive." There was a silence, and old Nate Cobb spat into the fire, and Ike Sunday said, quietly, "I come to finish what Elias started, boss. Man don't quit a thing account of it got hard. That's just when it got worth finishing." And Kuko said something soft in Spanish that Cora did not need translated, and Cole Yarrow said nothing at all, only got up and went to his horse, and came back and dropped a thing in the dirt by her fire. A fresh-cut ear-notch of hide, bloody, that he'd taken off a dead yearling they'd passed the day before, a stray with no herd, dead of a cutthroat in a coulee that Cora had taken for wolf work. He turned the piece of hide over with his boot toe, so the brand showed. It had been a bar M. You could still read the bar, faint, under the crude fresh anvil that had been burned over it with a running iron, the lines not yet healed, the hair still singed. "Found 6 like it in that coulee," Cole said. "They've been practicing on your strays, getting the iron hot." He looked at her across the fire. "It ain't a play no more, boss. It's already started. So no, nobody's drawing his wage." And that was the whole of the crew's answer. And Cora picked up the piece of blotted hide and folded it into the back of Elias's tally book, between 2 pages, flat like a pressed flower. And it was the first piece of the thing that would hang Ezra Bragg, though none of them knew it yet, and she wrote under the day's count, in her steady hand, 6 bar M strays found blotted to Anvil, coulee below Crazy Woman, kept the hide, and she closed the book on it. They pushed hard for 4 days after that, harder than was good for the flesh on the steers. Because Cora had made a cold decision and Cole had agreed with it, the anvil meant to hit them in open empty country, so the answer was to get out of open empty country as fast as flesh allowed and put the herd where a crime would have witnesses. There was a settlement ahead, a wool and freight town called Sabresville on the rail spur, 90 miles yet from Bannock Forks, but a town, with a deputy and a newspaper, and a stockyard and eyes, and if she could get her 600 through to the grass outside Sabresville, she could rest them and provision, and pick up the last leg with people watching. So they trailed sunup to full dark, and grazed the herd along at a walk to hold the weight, and stood double watches on no sleep. And the buzzards sat their ridges, and the bell rang every night over the bedground, and on the 4th evening they came over a long rise, and saw the smoke of Sabresville smudged on the sky 12 miles off, and Cora let herself believe, for about 1 hour, that she had read the play right and beaten it, that they would make the town and the witnesses and be safe. It was that night, the last night in the empty country, 12 miles short of the first witness, on a black moonless bedground under a sky gone thick and starless with the first weather of the coming winter, that the anvil came for the herd. It came at the worst hour, the dead middle of the night, when the first watch is worn out and the last is not yet up. And it came the way a professional does a thing, from the downwind side, in the black, with no moon and no warning but the one Blue gave. Cora was asleep in her blankets under the wagon with the tally book against her breast when the bell changed. That was what woke her, not a shout, not a shot, but the bell, which all night had been ringing the slow, soft, irregular chime of a grazing mare, and which now was ringing fast and high and steady, a hard, bright hammering, because Blue had her head up and was moving, and the mare had known before any human ear could that there were riders in the dark where no riders should be. Cora came out from under the wagon in her stocking feet, with her heart going, and Cole Yarrow was already up and pulling on his boots, swearing low and steady, and then the night came apart. They did it with wet cowhides and gunfire. 2 or 3 riders swept down the wind along the flank of the sleeping herd, dragging green cowhides on ropes and firing pistols into the ground. And there is not a herd on earth that will lie still for it. The whole 600 came up off the bedground as one animal in 1 second, with a sound like the world tearing, a booming, rolling thunder of hooves and horns and terror, pouring away downhill into the black. And the earth shook, and the dust rose, and the crew came up into their saddles, half-dressed, riding blind, into a stampede. Country they did not know, which is the thing that kills drovers, and would have killed one that night if the herd had run free. It did not run free, and the reason it did not was the mare. Cora got a bridle on Blue in the dark by feel, no time for a saddle, and went up on her bare back with a fist in the black mane and the bell hammering at the mare's throat. And she did the only thing there was to do, which was to give the mare her head and her heels, and ask her to run to the point of a stampede in the pitch dark over ground full of badger holes and cutbanks. And Blue ran. She ran on the blind side into the thundering black with her woman low on her neck, ran the way she had swum into the mill of horns. Trusting feet and ears, and the hands on the reins over the roaring dark she could not see. And she caught the leaders. She caught the front of 600 running cattle, and she turned them, bell ringing. And the leaders followed the bell because they had followed it all summer and all the long trail, followed it even in blind panic, because it was the one thing in their spinning world that meant safety. And the mare bent them, and bent them again, and brought the front of the herd around into the great slow circle. That is the only thing that stops a stampede, the mill, turning the run in on itself until the cattle ran themselves out against their own turning, and slowed and blew and stood, heaving, in a bunched trembling mass under the starless sky, held. Ike Sunday came up on the other point singing, his voice cracking with the strain of it, holding them with the old low song, and Kuko and Cole rode the wings, and old Nate Cobb, who could barely fork a horse, sat the wagon team across the mouth of a coulee with a lantern held high to turn any that broke. And between the bell and the song, and the woman and the 4 thrown-away men, the herd was held. But it was held short. That was the thing they learned when the gray light came. While the crew fought the front of the herd into the mill, Roy Deakins and the rest of the Anvil had done in the dark the thing the whole stampede had been built to let them do. They had cut the tail of the running herd, 100 head off the drag, where the terror poured downhill into a side coulee, and hazed them away south in the noise and the dust. A clean professional cut. 100 head of Barham steers gone into the Badlands toward wherever the iron was waiting, and by the time the light came to count by, the trail of the cut was cold, and the buzzards were nowhere on any ridge. Ike Sunday tallied the held herd twice in the gray dawn, grim, and it came 496. And Cora stood in the churned dirt and did the subtraction she did not want to do, 608 over the river. Less the 100 and some cut in the night, and a few more surely dead in the run. And she was, in the gray of that next morning, with the contract calling for 600 head at the cars, better than 100 head short, and one of her men was hurt. It was Kuko. His horse had gone down with him in a badger hole in the black and a dead run, the way she had feared for all of them, and the vaquero had a broken collarbone and 2 cracked ribs and a gash over his eye, and he was gray with it and would ride no more of this drive, though he cursed and swore he would, and Cole Yarrow set the collarbone by the fire, with Cora holding the man's shoulders and Nate Cobb pouring the last of the whiskey down him, and they strapped him up and made him a bed in the wagon, and that put the crew, for the last and hardest 90 miles, at 4, Cora, Cole, Ike, and old crippled Nate, who could not ride. 4, for near 500 head, with 100 more stolen into the Badlands and a storm coming. And the mare was hurt. Cora did not find it until the light was full, because Blue had said nothing, had stood the rest of that black night, on the point holding the mill with the thing done to her, and never so much as laid her ears back. But when Cora came to strip the bridle off in the dawn, she found the near shoulder, and the point of the chest laid open in a long, ragged gash, cut to the muscle, crusted black with dried blood down the foreleg. And she knew the wound the second she saw it, because she had seen its brothers on the blotted strays in the coulee. It was a barbed wire cut, a deep raking tear, and there had been no wire on that open bed ground, which meant that somewhere in the turning of the herd, in the dark, a man had ridden at the mare with a length of it, or strung it, to bring her down and take away from the widow the one thing that was beating them, and had failed, because the mare had run on through it and turned the herd anyway, with her chest torn open, and never quit. Cora stitched the mare that morning by full light on the ruined bed ground, kneeling in the dirt with the herd standing bunched behind her, and the storm weight thick on the sky, and she did it the way her stock doctor father had taught her at 11, and the way she had once, long ago, seen her husband do it, with a curved needle from the wagon's kit and a length of wax silk thread. 31 stitches to close the long tear, and the mare stood for it with her head down and her breath going slow and warm against Cora's back, and never flinched from the needle, though she had flinched from every raised hand in the county, because she was not afraid of what was in this hand, and Cora talked to her the whole time. Lo, the way you talk to hold yourself together, and not the horse. Telling her she was worth 10 of them, worth the whole Anvil and the man that owned it. Telling her Elias had been right and the county wrong, and that they were going to finish this drive, the two of them, if it was the last thing either of them did. And somewhere in the middle of it, 31 stitches into the chest of a horse the world had told her to shoot for $1. Cora Mercer finally, quietly, kneeling in the dirt with her hands full of silk and blood, cried, the first time in 2 years and more, cried for Elias, and for the 2 hard winters, and for the fouled spring, and the fired grass, and the 100 stolen steers, and the 4 good outcast men, and the torn, brave, blind-sided mare, cried it all out silent, with her forehead against the warm, wet neck, while she tied off the last stitch, and then she wiped her face on her sleeve and stood up and was done with it, because there was a storm coming and a drive to finish, and a widow who has cried her one cry is not weaker for it but lighter, and she knew the difference now. Cole Yarrow had watched the last of it from a little way off, not intruding, holding the horses. And when she stood he came, and looked at the mare's stitched chest, close and careful, a horseman's look, and then he looked at Cora's face with the tear tracks in the dust of it, and did not pretend he had not seen them, and he said, quiet, that's the best piece of doctoring I ever saw done in a field, and the bravest horse I ever saw stand it. He paused, and turned his hat once in his hands, and said the rest of it, which was as near as Cole Yarrow ever came in all that drive to the thing under everything. Your husband left you a good mare, Cora, but the mare didn't turn that herd last night. You did. On her. In the dark. Don't you let the county tell it any other way, and don't you tell it that way to yourself. And then, because it was more than he had ever said, and more than either of them could yet hold, he turned and hollered at Ike to get them strung out, storm or no storm. And the moment folded itself away to be opened later, and they put the short herd on the trail under a sky the color of a bruise, 90 miles from the cars, and 10 days from the 15th, and 100 head, and 1 good hand, and a full night's strength poorer than they had been at dark. And behind them in the Badlands the iron was heating, and ahead of them the first great blizzard of that killing winter was already piling itself blue-black over the big horns and starting, quietly, to come their way. They made the 12 miles into the Sabresville grass by dark, the short herd walking slow and sore, and the stitched mare walking slower, and they bedded the cattle on the flat below the town where the freight road crossed the spur track, and for the first time in a week they built a fire without wondering who would read the smoke. Because Sabresville was a town, small and mean and muddy, but a town, with a deputy and a doctor and a one-sheet newspaper. And a man who means to steal a herd does it in the empty country, and not under a deputy's window. Cora stood the first easy watch she had stood since the river, and let the tiredness come up in her like water in a dug hole, and did not fight it, and in the morning she did the sums that had to be done, and they came out to this: she was 100 head and a full week short of where she had meant to be, with a broken-boned vaquero in the wagon, and a stitched mare, and a storm-building blue-black. Over the mountains, and 80-some miles yet to the cars, and 9 days. She left Cuco Salas in Sabresville. It was the hardest order she gave on the whole drive, and he took it worst of anything that happened to any of them, cursing her in 2 languages from the wagon bed with tears standing in his eyes, swearing he could ride, swearing he had trailed cattle with worse than a cracked collarbone. And Cora stood at the tailgate and let him spend it all, and then said, quiet, Cuco, I need you alive to swear to what you saw at that board, not frozen adrift 80 miles short of it. You're my witness now, not my swing rider. Heel up. Come to Bannock Forks on the train when the doctor turns you loose, and stand up and tell the truth in a warm courtroom. That's the ride I need out of you." And that turned it, because it was true, and it was work, and it gave a proud hurt man a thing to do that mattered. And Cuco Salas wiped his face angrily on his good sleeve, and said he would be there if he had to crawl. And he was. The newspaper was the Sabresville Clarion, and the man who got it out once a week on a hand press in a shed behind the harness shop was named Merritt Poole, a stooped, gray, coughing man of about 50 who had been a lawyer somewhere back east before the consumption and some private grief drove him out to a dry country to die slower than the doctors promised, and who had, under the ink and the cough, the sharpest mind Cora met on the whole drive. He came down to her fire the first morning because a widow trailing 600 head with 4 men and a moon-eyed mare was the best story to walk into Sabresville in a year of Sundays, and he sat on an upturned bucket with his notebook and listened to the whole of it, the association floor, and the bridge, and the fouled spring, and the fired grass, and the stampede, and the 100-head cut, and blotted, and he stopped her only once, when she showed him the piece of hide from the coulee, the bar M feeding the anvil under the running iron. He turned it over in his ink-stained fingers and held it up to the light and coughed, and his tired eyes came alive. "Do you know what you've got here, Mrs. Mercer?" he said. "You've got the whole case, if you're fool enough to keep it and wise enough to use it. A brand is a burn, and a burn is a scar, and a scar remembers. A healed brand cuts deep and dark into the hide. An iron laid over it a season later burns only shallow and fresh. Any brand inspector worth his seal can wet shave and skin a patch and read the 2 burns from the underside and tell you to a certainty which was laid first. And a brand laid first cannot be the theft. You have cattle in that herd right now wearing a fresh anvil over a healed bar M. That is not a stolen cow, Mrs. Mercer. That is a confession, walking around on 4 legs, that no lawyer Bragg can buy is able to talk his way around, provided," and here he tapped the greasy tally book on her knee, "provided you keep an honest dated count that a court can walk up the trail with you, and provided you have 1 witness from the inside who will stand up and say he saw the iron heated. Loud men lose to quiet ledgers, ma'am, more often than the world lets on. I saw it 100 times at the bar before this country cured me of the law." He coughed and folded the hide back into her hand as if it were made of gold. "Keep every scrap, write down every hour. And God help the Colonel." Then he told her the things she had not yet known and needed to. Bragg had wired ahead. There was a message posted that very morning in the Sabresville telegraph office, plain for the operator, and thus for the whole town to read. From the Anvil to a lawyer at Bannock Forks, instructing that council to prepare a Stockmen's Association complaint against one Cora Mercer for cattle theft, to be sworn the day her herd reached the railhead. "He means to have you arrested at the cars," Poole said, "for stealing the very cattle his men stole from you. It is the most shameless thing I have read off a wire in 20 years, and it will very nearly work, because on their face those fresh Anvil brands say you are the thief. Very nearly." He stood, gathering his coat around his narrow chest, and there was something in his ruined face that had not been there when he sat down. A man who had found, at the frayed end of his life, one more thing worth doing. "I am going to print your story, Mrs. Mercer. All of it, this week, before you reach the cars, so that when Bragg swears his complaint there is already a printed account in the Territory that says the widow told it the other way first, with the dates and the hide and the wire from his own office. I cannot ride to Bannock Forks, and I cannot try your case, but by God I can put it in type where a judge can read it. And I can wire the whole of it to the Bannock paper besides. It is not much." He coughed. "It is what I have left after dark." He did not know he had quoted a dead man. Cora heard it, and did not correct him, and shook his ink-stained hand with both of hers. And that week the Sabresville Clarion ran the Widow's Drive across its whole single sheet, under a black headline. And the Bannock Forks paper picked it up off the wire, and by the time Cora Mercer's short herd came down out of the storm to the railhead, there was not a soul in the country who did not already know two versions of the story, and have begun, quietly, to wonder which was true. They rested the herd one day only, because one day was all the calendar would spare. And they laid in the last of the flour, and a sack of horseshoe nails, and a bottle of carbolic for the mare's stitches, and with 9 days left on the calendar, they pulled the reunited outfit out of Sabresville onto the last long leg. 4 riders and a widow and a chuck wagon and a cursed mare, and behind them the storm came down off the big horns at last in earnest. And ahead of them lay 80 miles of open country, and the blind box canyon off the Crazy Woman where a running iron was still heating, and Cora Mercer put the bell mare's nose to the north, and did not look back at the one warm town that had believed her. The storm gave them 1 day's grace, and Toby Hale used it. He came out of the south in the last of the failing light that first evening, riding a wind-broke Anvil horse he had plainly not asked leave to take, and he sat it at the edge of the firelight, with his young face pinched and gray and afraid and set. And Cora walked out to him before any of the men could, and stood at his stirrup looking up. "I couldn't stay, Miss Mercer," Toby said. The words came out of him in a rush, the way a boy confesses. "I tried. I took their wage like you said, and I told myself it weren't my business. And then last week Deacons had some of us, heating a running iron on the strays, showing us how you blot a bar M so the bar feeds the anvil, laughing about it, and I held horses 2 nights back. I didn't run no cattle, I swear it before God, I only held horses. But I seen it.
I seen them cut your drag, and I heard Deacon say where they was driving them. And I seen a man take a strip of wire to your bell mare in the dark on purpose. And I got up this morning and I couldn't. His voice cracked clean across. I know where the 100 head is at. There's a box canyon off the Crazy Woman, a blind draw with a wing fence.
They got them penned there, blotting them, as the iron gets hot, 4 men and Deacons. I come to tell you. And to give myself up to the law after, whatever it costs me, because I held the horses, and that makes me one of them, and I'd sooner hang honest than winter rich." He ran out of words and sat shaking. Cora Mercer reached up and put her hand on the boy's knee. "You didn't hold horses, Toby," she said, gently, and every man at the fire went still to hear her. "You rode all night through the start of a blizzard to bring a widow the truth and offer up your own neck for it. That's not what one of them does. That's the bravest thing I've heard of any man doing on this whole drive, and I'll say so to the judge with my hand on the book. Now get down and eat. You're home." And Toby Hale got down off the stolen horse and sat at her fire and ate, and wept into the beans a little where he thought no one saw. And old Nate Cobb saw, and said nothing, and gave him more. That night, by the tally book's light, Cora and Cole made the hard plan, and it was the mare's plan in the end. To drive the short herd onto the cars was to arrive 100 head shy and hand Bragg the shortfall he needed. To chase the 100 into the box canyon was to leave the main herd storm bound and undermanned, and lose it all. So they did the thing that could not be done, which was both, and they did it in the teeth of the storm, because the storm Cora saw was not only their enemy. "Deacons is holding stolen cattle in a blind draw with a wing fence," she said, "and there's a blizzard coming that his own colonel is too proud to drive ahead of. Those 4 men in that canyon are about to be a great deal more worried about freezing than about guarding my steers. The storm empties that canyon for us. We take the 100 back in the storm, when they've run for shelter, and we take the whole herd on to Bannock Forks behind the Mare, because there is exactly one horse in this country that can find a trail through a whiteout, and she's ours. Cole Yarrow looked at her a long moment across the fire, and then he almost smiled, the second time, and said, "Elias have said the same. Get some sleep. It'll be the worst day any of us ever put in." It was. The blizzard came down on them before dawn out of the northwest, not the soft feathering snow of a Christmas card, but the killing kind, a horizontal white roar of wind and ground blizzard that took the world away 3 feet past a horse's ears and dropped the cold through zero and kept dropping. The kind of storm that in that hard winter would empty the open range of the territory and pile the fence corners full of the drifted shapes of 10,000 head of cattle nobody had troubled to drive to shelter. And into that white nothing Cora Mercer put the moon-eyed mare, and the mare took them through. It was the blind side that did it. In the end, the very thing the county had condemned. A sound-eyed horse is ruled by its eyes, and in a whiteout its eyes are full of screaming white, and it will not face into it. But Blue had spent 9 years learning to travel by the senses under the eyes, by the feel of the ground's roll and the wind's quarter, and the smell of the sage and the pull of the low places where water and shelter lay, and a whiteout to Blue was only a louder dark. And she had made her peace with the dark before Cora ever knew her. She put her tail to the worst of it, and her nose to the country, and she walked them southwest to the Crazy Woman, and up it to the Blind Draw, and the Box Canyon was, as Cora had bet their lives it would be, all but empty, Deacons and 3 of his men gone. Run for the Anvil line camp ahead of the storm the way proud men's hirelings do, leaving one half-frozen boy of their own to hold 100 head of blotting cattle behind a brushwing fence. And that one gave it up without a shot the moment Ike Sunday loomed up white-crusted out of the storm on a white-crusted horse looking like the wrath of God, and threw down the running iron in the snow and put his hands up and asked, teeth chattering, could he please come along to wherever there was a fire, and they let him, and took the iron, and took the 100 head, 94 of them still alive and gathered, the blotted brands wet and raw and readable as a signed confession. And Cora had Cole cut a fence post free of the wing fence with a strand of the barbed wire still stapled to it and lash it aboard the wagon, wire and all, because on that wire, snagged and frozen, was a long-torn strip of greasy wolf hide, gray, ripped from the collar of a coat she had last seen on Roy Deacon's at a chain bridge, and she folded that fact away with the others. Then they turned the whole reunited herd, 590 head now, by Ike's frozen double count, downwind before the blizzard, and let the storm that was killing the territory's undriven cattle push their driven herd the last long miles to the cars, the bell ringing bright and constant through the white roar, the whole herd stringing behind the sound of it, because it was the only thing left in the world to follow, and the 4 men and the boy and the woman rode the drags and the wings frozen to their saddles, and did not lose the bell and did not lose the herd, and on the afternoon of the 14th of October, one day inside her contract, gray as ghosts and iced to the eyebrows and more dead than alive, Cora Mercer and the outfit the county had thrown away brought 590 head of Barham steers down out of the storm and into the shipping pens at Bannock Forks, and the mare walked through the gate at the point with 31 stitches in her chest and a bell at her throat and did not falter. And the railhead men who saw it come in out of that white death took off their hats without, knowing they did it, which is the only tribute the West ever paid that meant anything. And Ezra Bragg was there. He was there because he had known she was coming. The Anvil had wires and men everywhere, and because a proud man cannot stay away from the place his enemy is either going to be broken or be dangerous. And he had made, with his lawyer's help, his last and cleverest arrangement. Cora rode up to the buyer's office at the head of the pens to close the contract and put the tally in the man's hand. 590 head, 10 short of the 600, but with the reason for every missing head written in a dead man's book and provable in a brand board, and expecting the buyer, a Chicago money man named Amasa Coyle, to dock her for the 10 and pay her out and be done. And instead, she found Coyle behind his desk looking sick and would not meet her eye. And Colonel Ezra Bragg standing easy at the window with his hat in his hand, being kind, and the Bannock Forks deputy by the door looking unhappy, and a paper on the desk, and the paper was a Stockmen's Association complaint, sworn that morning, charging Cora Mercer with cattle theft, with running off and blotting 100 head of Anvil steers, whose fresh blotted Anvil brands. Bragg's affidavit swore would be found that very hour in her delivered herd, plain for any inspector to read. It was laid flat on Coyle's desk, the most beautiful trap Ezra Bragg had ever built, and Cora saw the whole cruel shine of it at once. His men had blotted the stolen 100 from Bar M to Anvil in the Box Canyon. She had recovered 94 of them and driven them proudly to the cars still wearing those fresh Anvil brands. And now Bragg swore before the law that those Anvil-branded cattle in her herd were his, stolen and blotted by her. And on their face, on the reading of any honest brand, that was exactly what they looked like. The thief accuses the robbed with the robbed woman's own recovered goods. If the board read the brands the plain way, the fresh Anvils would hang the widow for the very theft the Anvil had done, and Coyle would void the sale for a herd under a cloud of cattle theft, and the note would fall, and Ezra Bragg would ride home to the Anvil, having lost nothing but 100 head he had never owned, and taken everything. "I'm sorry it comes to this, Cora," Bragg said from the window, and the terrible thing was that some rind of him meant it. "I told you at the association there was an easy way. Cattle theft's a hanging matter in this territory, or a prison one at the least. But I'll speak for leniency, on account of your husband, if you'll sign the range over and let us settle it quiet." He had his hat in his hand. He was being kind. "No," Cora said. "We'll let the brand board read it in the open, Colonel, before witnesses, the way you like a thing done. I'll trust the hide." And she asked the deputy, in a voice that carried out into the pens, to send for the district brand inspector and for Judge Harmon Sledge, who was, as God and Ezra Bragg's ill luck would have it, holding circuit court in Bannock Forks that very week, and had already, at an association meeting a lifetime ago, taken his cigar out of his mouth to look hard at a small gray woman doing sums out loud. They held the hearing the next morning in the Bannock Forks courtroom, and the whole railhead came, and half the Sweetgrass that could get there through the snow. And it was as public as anything Bragg had ever staged, only this time he was not staging it. The brand inspector was a leathery old man named Chalk Beaumont, who had read brands for the territory for 20 years and could not be bought because he had already been offered everything and wanted none of it. Bragg's lawyer laid it out smooth and sorrowful. Here were 94 steers in the Mercer herd wearing the Anvil brand. Here was the Anvil's sworn tally, showing 100 head short off their Bannock range. The sad conclusion made itself. And then Chalk Beaumont was invited to inspect, and Cora Mercer asked the court's leave for the inspector to do the one thing that reads a blot for what it is, which is to wet shave and skin a patch of the hide, and read the brand from the underside, where the truth of a burn lives, because a healed brand scars the flesh deep and dark, and an iron laid over it later burns only shallow and fresh, and the hide remembers the order in which it was hurt. Chalk Beaumont skinned a patch the size of a supper plate off the hip of the nearest blotted steer, in front of the judge and the crowd, and Ezra Bragg, and he turned the wet hide over and held it up to the courtroom window, and the light came through it, and there it was for 200 people to see, the Anvil on the outside fresh and shallow and pink, not 2 weeks old, and beneath it, through the hide, deep and healed and 2 springs old, plain as a signature, the bar and the M that Cora and Elias Mercer had burned into a yearling in the spring they were married. The brand under the brand. The bar M feeding the Anvil, exactly as a running iron blots it, and no earthly way on God's ground for it to have gone the other direction, because you cannot heal a new brand old. Chalk Beaumont lowered the hide and said, in the dry voice of a man reading a verdict off a cow, "This here's a Bar M steer blotted to Anvil inside the fortnight, your honor. And so's the other 93. I'd stake my seal on it." Whoever swore this the other way swore false. After that it came apart for Ezra Bragg the way a herd comes apart, all at once and in every direction. Cora put Elias's tally book in the judge's hands, and the dated entries walked the court up the trail day by day. 6 Bar M strays found blotted in the coulee, the hide kept. The count short after the night the herd was stampeded, and the drag cut, 590 delivered. Every missing head accounted. She put on the stand young Toby Hale, who told it with his hat in his hands and his voice shaking, and never once looked at Bragg, how Deacons had heated the running iron and taught them the blot, how he had held horses the night of the stampede and seen the Anvil cut the drag, how he had seen a man take a length of wire to the moon-eyed mare in the dark on purpose, and how he had ridden through the storm to give it up and take his medicine, and the court and the county, looking at that white-faced boy choosing to hang honest rather than winter rich, understood that they were hearing the truth. She put on Ike Sunday, grave and unshakable, who had tallied every count. She laid on the clerk's table the running iron thrown down in the snow, and the fence post with the strand of barbed wire, and on the wire the long torn strip of gray wolf hide, and asked the court to note whose greasy wolf hide coat had been seen at the chained toll bridge with a piece torn fresh from its collar, and Roy Deakins, who might have brazened out one thing, could not sit still under all of them at once, and got up in the middle of it, and walked out of the courtroom, and out of Bannock Forks, and out of the Territory, and was not seen in the Sweetgrass country again, which the grand jury took, correctly, for an answer. And while the courtroom was still roaring, the last piece of it came in off the storm on a half-dead horse, the news that the blizzard had emptied the open range. The Anvil had trailed its own Bannock beef herd, 900 prime steers, only as far as the open flats above the railhead, and there held them loose to fatten a few more days, for a few more dollars a head, because Ezra Bragg was too rich and too proud to hurry his cattle to shelter ahead of a little early weather, and the little early weather had turned into the killing winter. And the Anvil's 900 had drifted before it with no bell and no mare, and no widow to turn them, and piled into the coulees and the fence corners and the frozen creeks, and the storm had done to the proud man's undriven herd exactly what he had prayed it would do to hers. He was ruined that week, not by Cora Mercer, but by the one arithmetic his money had never taught him, which was that the trail does not care what a thing is worth in the daylight, it asks what it has left after dark, and Ezra Bragg's 900 head, worth a fortune in the daylight of the sale barn, had nothing left after that first hard dark, and neither in the end did he. He walked out of the courtroom a smaller man than had walked in, and he did not stop being smaller. And by the next spring the Anvil wire was coming down in pieces, and the Sweetgrass water ran free again, where it had run free before he came. Judge Harmon's sledge cleared Cora Mercer of everything in one dry sentence, restored the 94 head to the Bar M on the record, referred Ezra Bragg and Roy Deakins to the grand jury for cattle theft, and for the fouling of a public spring and the firing of a bedground. And then, before he rapped his gavel, he did a thing not strictly in the law. He looked down over his spectacles at the small gray woman and at the blue roan mare that could be seen through the courtroom's open door standing hipshot and patient in the churned snow of the street with the stitches in her chest and the bell at her throat, and he said, to the whole room, dry as ever, I have sat this bench 20 years. And I have watched this county decide the worth of a woman and the worth of a horse by looking at the one thing about each it was too lazy to look past. It has cost this county, by my count this morning, one crooked colonel, one runoff range boss, and its own good name. He rapped the gavel once. The moon-eyed mare that this territory told the widow to shoot for $1 just brought the evidence that cleared her into my court on her own back, through a blizzard, blindside first. Court's adjourned. Somebody get that horse a barn. Amasa Coyle paid her out that same afternoon, 590 head at $22, $12,980, and docked her nothing, and was ashamed enough of the morning to offer for next year's steers on the spot at $1 over the market, which Cora took, because a widow does her sums whatever the weather. She rode home to the Sweetgrass through the melting first snow, with the draft cleared, and the tally book closed at last on a finished count. And she paid the $2,200 note over Josiah Frame's own counter in the Stockman's Bank of Ardennes in front of whoever cared to watch, and folded the canceled paper into the back of Elias's book next to the piece of blotted hide, The War and Its Ending, pressed flat together like 2 pages of one story, and she drove out home under a sky washed clean. The Bar M made an outfit that winter out of the men the county had thrown away. Ike Sunday stayed on as foreman at a foreman's wage and a foreman's respect, both a long time overdue. Cuco Salas heeled crooked and rode again by spring, and swore he would trail no other brand. Old Nate Cobb hung up his crutch behind a real cook stove in a real bunkhouse and cried about it again, once, and cooked for the outfit till he died in his bed 9 years later, which is the death a trail cook prays for. Toby Hale, cleared by his own honesty and the judge's mercy, grew that winter into the kind of man he had ridden through a blizzard to become. And the county, which had crossed the street on Cole Yarrow for 4 years over a lie told at Coyle's Reef, heard the whole of that lie undone in the same season, because a man who could boss 590 head through a stampede and a flood and a blizzard with 4 hands and a widow was plainly not a man who had ever betted a herd wrong or lost his nerve, and the crossing of the street reversed itself, as those things do, too late to be worth much, and just in time to matter. He stayed. He had never quite left, all that winter, finding reasons about the horses, and one evening at the tail of it, with the ice going off the Sweetgrass and the first green coming to the bench, Cole Yarrow stood at Cora's gate, with his hat in his hands, and did not make a speech, because he was not a man who made them. "I've got no name worth much and a quarter section up a dry draw," he said, looking out at the mare on the good grass and not at the woman, "and I'm too old and too plain to say a thing prettier than that. But I've drifted about as far as a man wants to drift. There's a place at your fire, if ever you'd have a man stop drifting at it." Cora Mercer looked at him a while, the way the mare looked at a new thing with her good eye, taking her time, and then she said, "There's a barn wants a farrier's hand, and a range wants a segundo, and a fire wants a man that knows when not to fill the quiet. Unroll your bed, Cole. Stay." And that was all, and it was enough, and there was no kiss on the gatepost that spring for the county to talk about, only a lamp that burned later in the Bar M kitchen than a widow's lamp had burned in 3 years, and a second horse in the home corral by summer, and after a while a quiet wedding at the little church in Arden that the sewing circle came to and behaved themselves at. And the bell mare turned out on the greenest grass of the bench to graze while it went on. She lived a long time, blew the scar on her chest healed to a seam under the roan, 31 stitches worth, and Cora never once let anyone forget how it got there or what it had turned. The mare raised no foals. That had gone by in the hard years. But she bossed the Bar M cavy for another 11 springs, the bell at her throat, the pale moon-colored eye catching the lantern light in the barn on winter nights, and throwing it back like a coin at the bottom of a well, and she went blind altogether in the good eye at the last, full blind, and it changed nothing at all, because she had spent her whole life learning to travel by the light the county could not see, and she followed her own bell to the water and back till the day she lay down in the deep grass and did not get up, and they buried her on the rise above the creek where the drive had started, and hung the bell on the marker. Elias Mercer used to say a thing over the worst of the winters. The thing that had gotten his widow up off the sawdust of an association floor and down 280 miles of trail no one thought she could ride. He said the trail does not ask what a thing is worth in the daylight. Any fool with a full belly and a fat ear can price a thing in the daylight. The trail asks what it has left after dark. And most everything folks throw away, he said, every moon-eyed mare and street-crossed man and used-up widow the county has already decided the worth of and quit troubling to look at, most of it is not worthless at all. It is only waiting, quiet, off at the edge of the firelight where nobody bothers to look, on the kind of dark that finally shows the world what it was always for.